that they would have any threat. And all of these and other evidence have shown that what we show in the past, in the cases of at least 3 journalists that we categorized as murder before this course, including Shireen Abu Akleh and Yasser Mortaja and Mahmoud Abu Hussein, who were killed in Gaza, that there was no justification for the use of lethal force by the Israeli army. And those and other cases that we call for independent investigation as war crimes, because the Israeli army did not live up to their commitments and obligation under international law.
And, of course, Shireen Abu Akleh was killed May 11, 2022, outside the Jenin refugee camp. Sharif Abdel-Quddus did a George Polk Award-winning documentary on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. He's joining us as well. But, Sharif, I wanted to ask you about this latest piece you did for The Intercept that's headlined, Israel bombed an Al Jazeera cameraman and blocked evacuation efforts as he bled to death. Give us the tick-tock, the chronology on what happened on that horrific day when he and Wael al-Dahdouh, who is the Gaza bureau chief for Al Jazeera, went to the school that was bombed. Tell us exactly what happened.
Right, Amy, and when we talk about the killing of Palestinian journalists in Gaza, this was an incident on December 15th where much of the world watched as hours ticked by as Samer Abu Da'a was wounded and prevented from getting medical care by Israel and eventually died. And so that timeline of what happened, I think, is extremely important. But basically, Wael al-Dahdouh, who is Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Gaza, went with Samer Abu Da'a, who's a 20-year veteran journalist, a cameraman. They went to this school in Khan Yunis, which had been bombed earlier in the day, and they were accompanied by a team of civil defense workers. That team had requested and received approval by the Israeli military through the Red Cross to be in the area. They got there around noon. They spent about 2.5 hours in the area. This is according to Wael al-Dahdouh. And as they were wrapping up their coverage, he said there were hardly anyone in the area. There were drones buzzing overhead. They were just about to leave and go back to the ambulance that had brought them there when a strike hit them at about 2:30 p.m. Wael al-Dahdouh was thrown to the ground. He said when he got up and kind of regained awareness, he realized he was bleeding quite profusely from his arm and that he would bleed to death if he didn't get medical attention. He looked over and saw the 3 civil defense workers who were accompanying them had been killed instantly. And then at a small distance away, he saw his colleague Samer Abu Da'a on the ground. He had been wounded in the lower part of his body. Wael said that he seemed like he was screaming. Wael at that point had lost much of his hearing from the blast, and that Samer couldn't get up. Wael realized the only chance that both of them had was for him to get to medical attention and get help to bring Samer out because he couldn't get up. So Wael somehow stumbled across about 800 meters to the ambulance that was waiting. He begged them to go in and get Samer, but they insisted on evacuating him first to a hospital in Khan Yunis and that another ambulance would go retrieve him. There are videos of Wael al-Dahdouh receiving treatment, wincing in pain, calling on people to go get Samer, telling them to coordinate with the Red Cross. What we understand from Wael and others is that an ambulance did go immediately to try and retrieve Samer from the area, but that they were fired on or in their area, in their proximity by Israeli forces. At the same time, Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Ramallah, Walid al-Omari, was making calls to the Red Cross. This is around 3:30 p.m. and asking the Red Cross to liaise with the Israeli military to allow 4 emergency crews to reach Samer Abu Da'a and Khan Yunis. So the Israeli military knew, at least by 3 or 3:30, that there was a wounded journalist who lay helpless that needed evacuation. And at the same time, news was spreading of Samer Abu Da'a's plight, and there's a group called the Foreign Press Association, which is a Jerusalem-based nonprofit representing reporters, mostly foreign reporters from over 30 countries. And there's a WhatsApp group which has about 140 of these journalists on it. One of the journalists, a freelance reporter and producer based in Jerusalem named Orly Halpern, posted just after 3 p.m. About Samer's plight and told the journalists, or called on them, to call Israeli military spokespeople and to demand that Samer be evacuated. And so the FPA was getting involved, senior members of the FPA, the Foreign Press Association, were getting involved, calling Israeli military officials, Israeli military spokespeople, senior ones, repeatedly asking for passage for Samer. And from what we understand, at The Intercept, we obtained screenshots of this WhatsApp group from multiple journalists in the group, and also from speaking with people involved in these efforts, that for hours, Israel did not give approval to these ambulances. Finally, after about
5 hours after Samir was initially wounded, a bulldozer was finally approved to go through to reach Samir, but by then he had already died. He had bled out. He was found with, he seemed to have removed his flak jacket and had tried to crawl and had died. And it was incredibly tragic. He had lain there. Al Jazeera had posted a live counter of the hours and minutes since he was wounded on its broadcast, and people were just watching. And he eventually died. And the next day, Jazeera announced it was preparing a legal file to submit to the International Criminal Court over what it called the assassination of Samir Abu Da'a. And so did Reporters Without Borders also included his killing in a filing with the ICC, war crimes against journalists killed in Gaza. So, the world should be outraged about this killing, about all the killings that are happening to Palestinian journalists in Gaza.
So, Sharif, in this particular case, there is no doubt that the highest echelons of the Israeli Defense Forces were aware that this journalist was wounded and in need of medical attention.
Yes, we have multiple journalists who we have screenshots of a WhatsApp group where they're discussing having spoken to Israeli military spokespeople in those hours and saying no approval yet. Ambulance is not cleared. A bulldozer is not cleared yet. So this took hours. And the Israeli military must have known very early on what the situation is. They're the ones who had repeatedly bombed the area. They knew there was rubble in the streets. There's near constant drone surveillance of Gaza. The Red Cross, we know, was liaising with the Israeli military to try and get approval. And yet they left, or they just didn't allow, by some accounts, firstly, ambulances were fired on that tried to reach Samir Abu Da'a. They returned back. This is the Palestinian Red Crescent and Civil Defense. And they were waiting then for approval. They also asked for Red Cross teams to accompany them to the area as a form of protection. And all of this is happening while Samir Abu Da'a is lying helpless. The Israeli military is not giving permission, and he eventually died.
And then again, that was Wael Al-Dahdou's camera person and dear colleague who bleeds to death over 5 hours. And then in the last weeks, his son, Hamza Al-Dahdou, also an Al Jazeera journalist, is killed in this Israeli airstrike, along with the AFP stringer, Mustafa Faraya, in an airstrike, a drone strike on a car. Sharif, final comments.
Yeah, I think, look, in this country, the journalistic community should be outraged, should be vocal in their outrage at Israel's killing of their colleagues in Gaza, and we haven't seen that. And let me just end by saying, in 2022, the Pulitzer Board awarded a special citation to journalists of Ukraine for the coverage of the Russian invasion and of the war. And the citation reads, quote, "Despite bombardment, abductions, occupation, and even deaths in their ranks, they have persisted in their effort to provide an accurate picture of a terrible reality," end quote. This is the case many times over for the journalists of Gaza, for the Palestinian journalists of Gaza. I doubt they will be receiving any such accolades, and that's where the problem lies.
Sharif Abdel-Quddus, independent journalist, wrote this piece for The Intercept. Israel bombed an Al Jazeera cameraman and blocked evacuation efforts as he bled to death. We'll link to it at The Intercept at democracynow.org. And Sharif Mansour, Committee to Protect Journalists Middle East and North Africa Program Coordinator, speaking to us from D.C.
As for that agreement between Israel and Hamas to allow more medicine into Gaza, it was negotiated by Qatar. Netanyahu said today that 2 Qatari Air Force planes will fly to Egypt tomorrow to deliver medicine, both for Israeli hostages and millions of Gazans who need it. For more on the direction of Israel's war in Gaza, as well as the splits within the Israeli war cabinet, we turn to David McCoskey, distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, former journalist, and was a senior advisor for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations during the Obama administration. David McCoskey, thanks very much.
Glad to be with you.
Welcome back to NewsHour. As we just said, there's a split in the war cabinet when it comes to hostages. It appears that Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on one side, Benny Gantz on the other. What's behind that, and how significant is it?
Look, I think it's very important. It's one of the 2 big conceptual debates in the 5-member war cabinet. Basically, the Netanyahu-Gallant school says the way to get the hostages is to put more military pressure in this war. The more you dig under the tunnels in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, where it is believed that Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar are located, the leaders of Hamas are located, the better you have a chance of securing their release. The other school is of the centrists, who happen to be 2 former IDF Israeli military chiefs of staff, pride themselves on their pragmatism. Benny Gantz, you mentioned, another Gadi Eisenkot, who lost his son, by the way, in this war. Yeah. And the 2 of them say, look, it's 102 days now with these hostages. You don't have all the time in the world. And the best way to secure the release is to cut a deal with Egypt, Qatar, whoever that may be. And then if that involves some sort of extended pause, so be it. You could always renew hostilities at a later time, but if, in terms of what to prioritize, hostages of the war, the priority should go to the hostages.
The second big division within the war cabinet, as you mentioned, is between Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister. Yesterday, Gallant said that Palestinians will govern Gaza in the future, something Netanyahu has not said. And then he took a not-so-subtle swipe. He said, quote, "Political indecision may harm the progress of the military operation." What's he saying?
So I think here, Gallant is saying, we can't just kick the can down the road about what does post-war look like. Let's be real. The Palestinian Authority should come back. They governed Gaza from 1994 to 2007 until Hamas kind of threw them off the rooftops in 2007 until this war. So the defense establishment wants the PA to come back. The prime minister, however, is very fearful that Gantz and Eisenkot, the centrists that enlarged his government after the October 7th atrocities, that they will walk, that they will go for elections, and that he will be stuck with the people holding the balance of power. Guess who? The hard right. And Mr. Smotrich, who was the finance minister, Ben-Gvir, who was the police minister, and the like. So he doesn't seem to want to offend those two, because he might think the future of his government depends on these two guys. So he won't say the words PA. He won't say the words Palestinian Authority. He won't say the word Palestinian. He'll just say, let's see what the war looks like afterwards. Right now, we don't have to decide.
But this isn't only about politics, David, as you know, right? This is life and death for many people. This is the fate of the war itself, right? This is important.
Of course. I think the Secretary of State's visit to the region last week was, okay, look ahead a bit now. Are you going to allow people to go back to their homes in northern Gaza? You wanted to keep Palestinians from being killed. You told 1 million people go to the south. Okay, now you've almost won the north. Not yet, but almost. Do you have a plan to bring them back to their homes? And if so, who's going to run public orders? Civilian services, basic services. And so I think what Gallant and Halevi are trying to tell Netanyahu is, hey, we can't just kick the can down the road. There are going to be some decisions we have to make sooner rather than later.
There is some genuine frustration in the Biden administration with Netanyahu himself. Is Netanyahu listening?
Not sure. I mean, I think the president in particular, who's wildly popular in Israel, I just came back. Every meeting starts with, thank you, Joe Biden. It's very personal there, almost as if he's like the father of the country. He's viewed as someone who really cares about their security, and I think that's very important. But somehow that public support is not translated when he says, okay, Bibi, this is what I want you to do, which is there's certain tax transfers that you owe the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Yet here, I think Netanyahu is more concerned about political calculations, about the hard right, and I think the president is right to press the point with the prime minister.
As you were saying to me earlier, whenever President Biden or any U.S. official brings up two-state solution right now, it lands like a lead balloon. Do you think, quickly, there is a different way to talk about the two-state solution that the U.S. could find?
When we in America talk about two states, and some of us, for our lives, we want something that gives dignity to both sides, and I still think it's the right approach. But a lot of us, and in the administration, they assume that Palestinian state is going to look like Costa Rica. Yet with the Israelis here, two states, they say, look at the industrial capacity Hamas was able to do. By the way, without smuggling in things, their own industrial capacity. They see that state as looking more like North Korea. And therefore, we need to somehow talk about what sort of two-state solution we're talking about. And not just what the borders are going to be like, and I myself have worked on this issue, but how are we going to enforce it? We say the word demilitarized, but the Israelis are convinced that Hamas will always outmuscle a more pragmatic Palestinian leadership to take it in a very different, more militant direction. And we got to feel there's got to be a way to talk about this in a way that we're talking about the same sort of two states. Because right now, us in the U.S. and them in Israel, we're just talking past each other.
David Makovsky, always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fresh off his win in Iowa, former President Donald Trump spent time in a New York City courtroom. The trial that started today will decide how much he owes writer E. Jean Carroll for defaming her while he was president. Mr. Trump was already found liable for sexually abusing Carroll in the Between the House GOP's government funding fight and former President Donald Trump's hold in the Republican Party, much has been made of the far right's strong sway over the GOP and its agenda. But what doesn't get nearly as much attention is the far left's influence in the Democratic Party. I sat down last week with Joshua Green to discuss just that. It's the focus of his latest book called The Rebels: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Struggle for a New American Politics. Joshua Green, welcome to the NewsHour.
Good to be with you, thanks.
In the book, you trace the rise of the modern-day progressive movement to the 2008 financial crisis. How was that a clarifying moment and a catalyst for progressive politics and progressive politicians?
I mean, to me, the 2008 crash and its aftermath was the defining event in recent U.S. political history, and then it gave rise to this furious populist backlash on the right, which eventually gave rise to Donald Trump, but also on the left, which gave rise to my characters. First, Elizabeth Warren, then Bernie Sanders, who nearly succeeded in winning the Democratic nomination in 2016, and then ultimately to this new generation of younger progressives, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the cohort around her in Congress.
You mentioned Elizabeth Warren, and in the book you explore how she ultimately emerged at the center of the government's response to the financial crisis. And at the time, she was an unlikely voice in that regard. Walk us through her evolution based on your reporting.
Yeah, Warren's a fascinating figure. I got to know her just after the crisis. She was still a Harvard law professor, but she had just been appointed one of the overseers of the government's bailout of Wall Street after the crash. And she used that fairly obscure position as a platform to really go after the Obama administration, the banks, and articulate this version of left-wing populism that really hadn't had a voice in recent American political history. It wound up catching fire, really starting a movement. And within a few years, even before she ran for Senate in 2012, people in Washington would talk about the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party. So it helped give rise to this new brand of progressivism that we saw rise up in the wake of the crisis.
And fast forward to the current moment, how do you view the progressive influence on President Biden's agenda? Because you could argue that he has governed like an economic populist, and in many ways far less than the centrist Democrat that he was expected to be given his long track record.
Which is really a remarkable evolution. I mean, when I first came to Washington as a reporter in 2000, Biden was a senator from Delaware, was known as a great friend of business, was sometimes jokingly referred to as the senator from corporate America. I think Biden's evolution in particular has been an interesting one because he was in the White House with Barack Obama as his vice president when that first crash hit, and then when he was elected president, inherited another great economic crash that followed the COVID pandemic. And the response to those two crashes, I think, illustrates what an effect these populists have had. After COVID, Biden put in place multiple rounds of stimulus, unemployment benefits, student loan freezes, small business loans, but all of it focused on the middle class in a way that hadn't necessarily been true of the response to the 2008 crisis. And so when you hear Biden speak today about the economy, he talks about building it from the middle out. He shows up on union picket lines. He does things that would have been fairly unimaginable for a centrist Democrat to do, 10, 15, or 20 years ago.
What is it about the Democratic brand of populism that's different from the kind of populism that Trump supporters prefer?
Well, the populism that I write about with Warren, Bernie, and Ocasio-Cortez is really focused on economic populism. And I think my last book, Devil's Bargain, was about the rise of Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and right-wing populism. And mostly, I think that's focused on a kind of cultural populism. A lot of anger toward immigration, America First nationalism. Certainly, there's some economic components. Trump is very hawkish toward trade. He put in place steel tariffs that the Biden administration has kept in place. There are areas of overlap, but to me, it's the cultural element that distinguishes the right-wing populism from the left-wing populism that I write about in this book. Facebook.
What about the politicians themselves? Is there a ceiling of support for progressive candidates? Democrats who might support progressive policies. There hasn't been enough support from the Democratic base to propel one of the progressive politicians into the White House.
It's an interesting question, because if you go back to 2019, I was embedded with Warren and with Sanders for a time during the Democratic primaries when they were both running for president. It seemed like in the moment that progressive politics was really taking off, and yet neither one of them emerged as a Democratic nominee, partly because there were two of them running and they split the progressive vote. But really, I think there is a ceiling on candidates who are explicitly defined as left-wing progressives in Democratic primaries. It's really only in deep blue places like Ocasio-Cortez's district in New York and a few other places where these true left-wing progressives, Democratic socialists, have been able to get themselves elected. But we've seen in a lot of races since then, in Democratic primaries and general elections, that they try and they fail. So one of the arguments I make in the book is the future of this brand of progressivism may not be through these particular politicians, but through politicians like Joe Biden, who kind of code as more moderate, as more centrist, but who still take up and put into place a lot of the politics that my characters gave rise to.
The book is The Rebels: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Struggle for a New American Politics. Joshua Green, thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Of the war by Palestinian.
And obviously the starvation. Only the families of the hostages, only the scenes where you don't see Palestinians at all. It seems as if they don't exist. Now, Amy, that's not new, because the Israeli media betrayed its mission by covering in the same way the occupations throughout so many years. It was always dehumanizing the Palestinians as much as possible. But this time we reach a level that I don't remember such a level, because you can really watch for hours Israeli TV and have no clue what's going on in Shifa Hospital or in other hospitals or in uprooted neighborhoods, and where are the people, how do they make their living, do they get some food? Nothing of this. Nothing which might remind us that the Palestinians are human beings. This is almost a taboo. Don't mention them as human beings.
Gideon, Prime Minister Netanyahu keeps assuring the international community that Israel does not intend to permanently occupy Gaza. But what is he saying domestically to the Israeli people? He even has two Twitter handles, one that's an official one, and then another that is more geared toward sending out incendiary messages to the population.
Just this morning, he was quoted in a private talk, I think, that the war will continue at least until 2025. And nobody sees the end. Nobody knows the end. There is no end game. There is no plan what to do the day after. And Israelis start to believe now that this might last for many years, at least the occupation of Gaza, obviously without intention. Almost everything that Israel did in the last decades was without intention. But it always came out. It never intended to go for wars. It always finds itself in war. It never intended to create an occupation of over 50 years. And it came out like this. No. The intention is one thing and the results are another thing. Israel has no plan to leave Gaza in the coming months or years, which doesn't mean that Israel will stay there. But I don't see any alternative right now. What will they do?
I wanted to ask you about your paper, Haaretz, reporting that a group of family members of Israelis who were killed in Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th in the Hamas attack on Israel are demanding a probe into how their relatives died. An Israeli brigadier general recently admitted he ordered an Israeli tank commander to fire on a home where Hamas fighters were holding 15 Israeli hostages. Brigadier General Barak Hiram told the New York Times he'd ordered the tank commander to, quote, break in even at the cost of civilian casualties. 13 of the Israeli hostages died. Only 2 survived. You're a member of the Haaretz editorial board, which recently ran a piece headlined, "The IDF must investigate the Kibbutz Be'eri tank fire incident right now." Elaborate on what happened and the investigation your editorial board is calling for now.
Look, everyone is postponing all the investigation to the day after, and the day after seems to get farther and farther, and we are very concerned that it will never be investigated. But here we have a very concrete case, and families, rightly so, want to know who is responsible for the killing of their beloved ones and how did it happen. The Brigadier General that you just mentioned happened to be a settler. I don't want to say that it says a lot, but let's remember that many of our high-rank generals, or more and more of them, are settlers, and settlers have their own ideology, even when they serve in the army. They have their own motivation, which is not always a very secular motivation. It's not always the motivation of the others. But in any case, the fact is that those people were killed and might have been rescued. It must be investigated. It's not very complicated to investigate it. It's a very concrete and focused event, and we were calling the army to do so. I don't know. Until now, we didn't hear from the army. I hope they will do it, because this can have also a lot of consequences in the coming days or weeks or months in Gaza, because this situation might repeat itself when we will face a house where there are hostages and commanders of Hamas. Do we shoot them all dead? I really wonder.
And you also had a piece on how sexism ultimately killed what are known as the spotters. The Israeli military, the women who were on the border, who were seeing Hamas gear up, were telling their supervisors, it looks like there's about to be an imminent attack. And some were even told if they'd raise this again, they would be brought up on charge of insubordination.